So section 3, the origin and development of the human predator-prey relationship. The exact process that led to social stratification, class-based variance in social power and wealth, and complexity, a term that reflects the number and variety of technologies, social roles, and institutions in a society, is still unclear after decades of research by historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists. However, some general features of this evolutionary pathway have been clear at least since the 1960s. For tens of thousands of years, all humans subsisted by hunting and gathering. People usually lived in small groups, most of which were nomadic, though in particularly abundant regions, it was possible for settlements to persist in place. Some of these settlements were ceremonial or trading centers. Authority within groups was mostly situational, based on demonstrated knowledge and skill. Anyone who felt oppressed could, in principle, at least simply leave. Under harsh natural conditions, some groups raided other groups' stores of food, often wounding or killing fellow humans in the process, occasionally taking captives. Revenge raids or killings would often follow. Archaeological research has shown that levels of interpersonal violence among hunter-gatherers varied greatly, but were generally very high. Simple horticultural, i.e. gardening societies emerged as animals and plants began to be domesticated, though a large proportion of calories still came from hunting and gathering. Domestication is actually a big part of Scott's book, and he talks about this as being sort of the precursor or one of the necessary steps in order for agriculture even to have emerged. So he talks about what he calls the 4 domestications. He talks about the domestication of plants, animals, fire, and humans. And I've said that I would also probably include the domestication of water as well. That I think that's another one that could have been included in the mix, is the ability to be able to refashion or reshape landscapes to be able to take advantage of whatever available water there was. So that's another big one. So he says, continuing, these societies tended to establish temporary villages, and political organization often featured a big man, quote unquote, who gained influence and prestige through demonstrations of generosity and redistribution, but who exerted no coercive authority. Complex horticultural societies established stationary towns, a few of which were large enough to be called cities. Some production was for exchange, and trade expanded. These societies were organized around chiefs who were hereditary and enjoyed privilege as well as influence and prestige. Among some groups, warfare became highly ritualized and valorized. Pastoral or herding societies tended to exist in marginal environments such as deserts. Their subsistence revolved around the keeping of domesticated grazing, ruminant animals, including cattle, goats, sheep, and members of the camel family. These pastoral societies, while usually migratory, again featured hereditary chiefs, were highly patriarchal, and often inclined toward warfare as a cultural organizing principle. The advent of agricultural societies, defined by the growing of field crops, eventually brought cities and full-time division of labor. Societies became much larger, each identifying itself with a specific geographic region over which the state claimed ownership. Social stratification also appeared, sometimes in the form of a rigid intergenerational caste system, echoing the trophic levels of natural ecosystems. The peasant producer, quote unquote, class was far more numerous than the ruling or elite class. Soon there were also full-time soldiers, artisans, artists, merchants, moneylenders, and so on. Money, law, prisons, standing armies, and writing all appeared at this stage. This is something that actually Diamond talks about, how what we commonly associate with history, or sort of the unfolding of history, is intimately tied to the development of agriculture, because agriculture allowed for the establishment of states. And again, this is what Scott talks about, is that states arose with the development of agriculture and all of the domestications that made agriculture possible. And then this is where all of the things that we assume or kind of take to be the normal trappings of our lives, this is when it all starts. So it's really fascinating to be able to step through the process by which all of these things begin to come together. At the head of the state was a divine king whose family shared in this coercive authority as well as his privilege and prestige. This is the point at which predation, quote unquote, within human society, not just between societies, appears to have become institutionalized. At the same time, however, levels of interpersonal violence, excluding warfare, i.e., intergroup violence, declined significantly. So again, that's an interesting point. In some instances, an agricultural society appears to have been conquered and dominated by a smaller but highly aggressive pastoral group, whose hereditary rulers then pursued the project of wider conquest. This appears to have been the case in ancient and medieval China, for example, though there were also instances where expanding agricultural states appear to have preyed, quote unquote, upon peripheral pastoralists. Actually, this is something that Ibn Khaldun talks about in the Muqaddimah, which again is seen as being the first book, one of the first books, if not the first book, of kind of one of the first historical surveys. The result then was the establishment of an empire, with a central state systematically siphoning wealth from the peripheral colonies. Often people from conquered lands were imported to the capital as slaves, right? So again, in this instance, what does slavery represent? And I've written pieces about this, kind of trying to look at slavery from a systems thinking point of view. Slaves were simply the oil before oil. They were the energy source before the advent of fossil fuel being able to be converted into work that was performed by machines, right? So again, human chattel was the oil before oil. This explains why, if you go in and you look at, there's another great book by Edward Baptiste called The Half Never Told, which is basically, it's an account of how slavery provided the basis for the emergence of American capitalism, or capitalism generally speaking. There's another book that talks about the beginning of thinking of human beings as consumers. That also talks about the role that slavery plays in the establishment of that system. I think that the title of the book is The Empire of Things, where apparently according to the author, that slavery actually represented or provided probably the most perfect consumer good, or sort of or the basis for exchange of goods and the development of capital of any product in human history. At the inception of the Civil War, the American Civil War, slaves represented the most valuable class of assets in the American economy. Actually, by themselves, they were worth more than all of the other asset sectors combined. So that would have included the railroads, the banks, all of these asset classes. So again, very, very interesting to position this in the confines of history overall. So this simple schema runs the risk of oversimplification. Indeed, recent research has uncovered surprising exceptions at each stage along the way, including hunters and gatherers who were mostly sedentary, and early cities that were egalitarian and showed no evidence of stratification. The path of social complexification and stratification often meandered and doubled back. Nevertheless, the essential trend persisted. As people organized themselves within ever larger groups and exploited their environments more systematically, coercive authority tended to appear. Whether in Central America, Europe, North Africa, South Asia, or East Asia, a relatively small elite group took charge and gained wealth and power. The masses, meanwhile, were held in a condition of relative poverty, their labor organized and controlled by overlords. At this time, the most advanced, quote-unquote, societies grew in complexity, power, and sophistication. Among social scientists, there have been two schools of thought with regard to the origin of stratification and complexity. Joseph Tainter, in the collapse of complex societies, another text you can actually find that online as a PDF, summarizes these schools of thought clearly. Conflict theory, writes Tainter, asserts that the state emerged out of the needs and desires of individuals and subgroups of a society. The state, in this view, is based on divided interests, on domination and exploitation, on coercion, and is primarily a stage for power struggles. Karl Marx and his followers were prominent exponents of conflict theory. In contrast, again quoting Tainter, integrationist theory suggests that complexity, stratification, and the state arose not out of the ambitions of individuals or subgroups, but out of the needs of society. Even some apparent instances of domination and exploitation, in this view, may have emerged because there was a common advantage to such arrangements. Tainter, who regards the development of complexity as a problem-solving strategy adopted by society as a whole, suggests that a synthesis of conflict and integrationist views is needed, but leans toward the integrationist position. The most interesting recent work related to this question has come from cultural evolution theorists such as Peter Turchin, who suggests that near constant warfare was the mechanism that led from one stage of social organization to the next. Very interesting. The subtitle of Turchin's 2016 book, Ultra Society, How 10,000 Years of War Made Humans the Greatest Cooperators on Earth, encapsulates his thesis. In essence, he persuasively argues that internal complexity based on cooperation enabled societies to compete more effectively with one another under conditions of frequent bloody conflict.